Hi, guys. Yeah, okay. I am so happy to be here with you guys. You guys doing all right? Yeah, the energy level is booming in here. All right. So as a lot of you know, it's that time of year where people are graduating, finals are happening, people's anxiety levels are through the roof. And so I just want to pray with you guys one more time as we come crashing into Sabbath as a community and just ask God to be present. Dear God, thank you so much for this day. Thank you so much for being an active God, a God that is alive in our lives. And I just ask that today as we talk about gospel, that we see you in our lives and that we see how active and wonderful you can be. We love you so much in your name, amen. So I have a problem. I have a staring problem. I don't know if you guys have ever noticed this. Sometimes I'll sit in a room and just stare. And it could be an inanimate object. I could just stare at the wall for a while. Or sometimes it gets a little bit creepier and I just stare at people for quite some time. And when I lived in Washington, D.C., I actually had a huge problem with this because I would do my homework on the metro. And I would sit in the metro and I would just stare at people. And then later I'd see them at a coffee shop or at the Capitol or something. And I would go up to them and be like, hey, and give them a huge hug because I was so sure I knew them. But it's because I was staring at them. And, staring can be misleading. Eyes can be misleading. And I still remember one time in high school, my music teacher, he was getting really frustrated with all of us, and he was like, okay, I just need all of you to sing and play with your eyes. And I was like, right. And he was like, I'll show you. So I want to see if you guys get this. Happy Sabbath. What did I just say? Merry Christmas. So obviously the communication patterns can get a little weird, right? And I remember he was getting so frustrated with us because he was like, just project with your eyes, project with your eyes. And I'm like, I'm projecting with my eyes. And it was getting misinterpreted. Looks and eye contact are incredibly good. After all, the eyes, are the windows to the soul. Also, they are not just mirrors, but projectors. Looking is powerful, seeing is brilliant, but I can't tell you how many times I've eye motioned across the room and someone's got it totally wrong. I'm like, go over there, and they leave. I'm like, well, eye communication doesn't always go as flawless as we want. Looking is powerful. Ever since I was a baby, I kind of shifted from just staring at things also to touching everything. I not only would stare, but then I would pick everything up and I want to touch everything, and I'd move things from one side of the room to the other. My parents said I was always carrying bundles of things across the house, and I'd be placing them around, and I would be organizing them by texture and color and size and all these different things. Tactile abilities as children is one of the first things we learn. That's why our toys are so interactive. That's why there's so many different fabrics on a stuffed animal, because as humans, we are naturally drawn to textures and things that we can touch. You would think that I've grown out of most of this, but perhaps that's why I'm an artist. Because I love textures, and I still touch everything, as you know if you walk with me through the mall. I can't help but touch everything along the way. And in Psychology Today, they did an article about the power of touch. They ran all these tests talking about various forms of communications. It says, if touch is a language, it seems we instinctively know how to use it. But apparently, it's a skill we take for granted. When asked about it, the subjects in Hertenstein's studies consistently underestimated their ability to communicate via touch. They constantly thought they wouldn't be able to communicate clearly, even while their actions suggested that touch may, in fact, be more versatile than voice, facial expression, and other modalities for expressing emotion. The study showed healing and health and clear communication being 75% higher than they had expected. They didn't realize how important touch was. And as I continued to study, they realized more and more how incredibly powerful just touching was, and how clearly you could communicate all sorts of emotions through touch. As almost all of you know, by pretty much sheer awkwardness, I tend to be a hugger. I love being in people's spaces. I remember when I was a clinical chaplain, sometimes I'd sit in a room with a family that had just had something terrible happen, and I would run out of words, and I would run out of body language to be like, I would get stressed, and anxiety would be filling the room as nobody there knew what to say or how to articulate the pain that was in the room. And I remember the very first time that I ran out of everything good to say. All of my textbook answers were just out. And finally, I just went over to the guy, and I just put my hand on his shoulder and stood there. When he left, he told me that the most amazing thing that had happened during that experience was just realizing that he was not alone. The power of touch. When words fail you, what are you doing with your touch? Kids feel it too, as you can see my adorable niece. When my nieces are riding in the back of the car, when they're anywhere near me, they have this desire to touch. How many of you guys have kids? How many of you guys have had them screaming in the back of your car? How many of you have somehow shut them up by merely placing your hand in the car seat? And they grab onto that hand so tightly, and as they hold on, suddenly they fall asleep or they stop whining and crying. Touch is power. Kids know it. Babies cry till they're held. Couples love to cuddle. Friends hug when they see each other's. Communities come and sit in each other's spaces in happiness and in pain. We've been talking here about reimagining the gospel. Gospel is the good news of God's reign in our lives here and now, a kingdom with very different values than many of us have set it up to be. Gospel is meant to be good news of a new reign. The challenge is always figuring out how to redefine it from our task-oriented mindset, getting to heaven, or being perfect in order to get to heaven, or doing the right thing. That's often our motive. Not focusing on the present reality of living and experiencing it. The question then becomes, how do we experience it in a way that gives healing and brings us to something that we want to share with someone? In the Old Testament, spirituality and God tend to stand at a distance. When Israel was given the law, they stood far from it. They obeyed and did as was decreed. They did their to-do list and patted themselves on the back for being obedient. They felt salvation from following rules and looking correct. As you move through the Bible, you come crashing into the New Testament. Something shifts. Jesus shows up. The long-predicted, the all-encompassing bundle that introduces God in an incredibly raw form. God takes the opportunity to call us through Jesus to move in a little bit closer. Not just closer to him, but closer to each other. He reminds us that the greatest commandment is to love God and to love each other. Later on in John 21, Jesus asks Peter 3 times, and he says, "Do you love me?" And Peter stands there and he looks at him and he goes, "Yeah, of course." And Jesus says, "Then feed my sheep." And then Jesus says again, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter goes, "Yeah." He goes, "Then feed my sheep." And he does this a third time, and every time Jesus says, "Feed my sheep," Jesus points out time and time again that we are called to do so much more than just greet each other in passing, but we are to commune with each other in a deeper, more powerful way. The gospel message suddenly is turned upside down. We are no longer called to stand at a distance, but we are called to get into people's spaces. We are no longer asked to be politically correct. We are called to love across borders, even amidst conflict. Breaking comfort zones is the worst. I mean, realistically, it's nice to be distant from some gross things, and sometimes it's easy to be able to go to our home and stay very disconnected from what's happening outside the walls. So what do you do when you realize you no longer are supposed to have a hierarchy? How do you feel when you realize that the law that keeps the filth and all the grossness of humanity away from you is supposed to be where you are? What do you do when the law that once kept you away from humanity suddenly opens their arms to you? How do you react? So let's go to the best example that I like to look at constantly. Of course, it's Jesus. We'll jump right in. Number 1, Matthew 8. It says, when Jesus came down off the mountainside, a large crowd followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." It says, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priests, and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." Okay. Jesus just jeopardized not only his social standing by coming in contact with someone who was unclean, but also his health. As you know, leprosy at that time was an incurable disease. At that time, anyone who had it was exiled into a community far outside of the safe community, and they were not allowed to come back unless they were either cleansed and approved by the priest or died. The fact that Jesus allowed the leper to even come near him was a pretty huge deal. And then to actually reach out and touch him was absolutely unheard of. but healing happened. Not only healing, but Jesus disrupted all the thoughts by touching. And this disruption of not only healing, but touch allowed the leper to be able to rejoin society once more. In this story, Jesus is in the process of going from one crazy experience to another. He is constantly showing people that there is more to life than just saying words, but there's actions that can follow them if you're. The next story, number 2, Mark 5. In this story, Jesus is again traveling through the communities. He's on his way to Jairus' daughter's bedside where she is dying. The crowd is just buzzing crazy around him. He's being surrounded by just crazy amounts of people. And in this moment, this woman has this opportunity, and she has been struggling for 12 years. No doctor has been able to heal her. Nobody has been able to give her peace or hope. And finally, she says, "This is my time." And for 12 years, she had just labeled herself as societally unclean. As you know, during that time, with the issue of blood, women were not allowed to be anywhere near society. So they would go outside of the communities, or if they came near anyone, they would have to yell unclean, which is just awkward if you ask me. And here this woman goes bursting into this crowd, and as she gets into this crowd, she sees Jesus, and she knows that this is her opportunity. She knows that probably he can't speak to her. She knows that he's busy, and it says in some of the commentaries and in Scripture that she just fell and she reached out and she tried to grab his hem. That's all she wanted. She just knew that if she could touch just a bit of him, she knew that healing would happen. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Now, if you picture this scenario, you know that there's so many people pressing in that even the disciples said, "How did you even know someone touched you? Look around you, Master." And he turns around, he makes eye contact with this woman, and I can just envision him helping her up and saying, "It was you." And he blesses her and he sends her on her way because immediately she felt relief. Immediately healing had come. And now, for the first time in 12 years, she could come out of her social and religious isolation and rejoin society. She had worth again. Now, for all of this time, you can picture that people are just looking at Jesus. He's breaking all the social norms. He's bursting into people's spaces, and he's encouraging them. And not only is he verbally encouraging them and changing and revolutionizing their thoughts, but he is reaching in and absolutely physically touching them. Number 3. Sorry, I can't read. Mark 8. They came to Bethsaida. A lot of you guys know this story. It's the story of a blind man. He's being brought into Jesus, and the guys are like, "He's blind, we don't know what to do." Jesus had every opportunity at this moment to walk away, to step aside and say, "You know what, I have other things I have to do," because he was clearly en route somewhere. But instead, Jesus takes the blind man and he leads him outside of the walls, and he gets him out there and he spits into the dirt. And you guys know the story. He takes a grimy mix of dirt and spit and begins to rub it in the man's eyes. Says, "Do you see anything?" That's what Jesus asked the man, and the man looks up and he says, "I see people, but they look like trees walking around." And once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes, then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly, and Jesus sent him home. Jesus touched the blind man not just once, but twice. He actually touched his eyes twice, maybe to show that some healing comes in stages. Maybe to show that not everything is clear so easily. I like this story a lot because the blind man was brought to Jesus, and Jesus took the opportunity to take him away from the crowds and the showmanship. He took him outside the city, grabbed some filth, and rubbed it in his eyes, and brought clean holiness and life to a man who was broken. Power came from this combination of personal time, touch, and mud. There are so many miracles and moments in scriptures where touch symbolizes healing, where the good news went from mere words to a way of living. In each of them, there are layers of healing that occur: physical, emotional, societal. And I love that Jesus not only heals, but he restored peace and community. He gave people more than health. He gave them worth. And I think one of my absolute favorite ones comes in Luke 22, and it's a story that almost all of you know. with this beautiful cartoon illustration. It's a story of betrayal, where Judas walks up and he betrays Jesus with a kiss. The symbol of compassion and love and greeting is now marred, and it turns all of this into a scene of horror. And as people realize what are happening, the disciples react as any disciples would or best friends would. And Peter, as it says, he grabs his sword and he starts swinging. And as he swings, he hacks off some guy's ear. Now, this is the prime opportunity for Jesus to be like, all right, you all kind of suck, so I'm not going to do anything. But instead, what does Jesus do? Jesus says, stop. And he reaches down and he picks up this ear and he goes to the man and he touches his ear and he heals him. If you look at this, even in the darkest moment of betrayal, impending doom and danger, Jesus takes the opportunity to heal his enemy, to put him back together, to pick up all of the broken pieces and unite them. Jesus understood the power of touch. He understood the act of being in someone's space was gospel, and that was the good news. The leper was isolated and doomed to die in a community filled with disease. The woman was societally and religiously banned and unclean. The blind man was unnoticed and common enough to ignore. The guard was technically his enemy. Jesus understood healing. He understood that gospel was more than just words. It was a way of living, an action. Jesus illustrates the gospel in motion. Jesus uses the gospel to restore health, restore place in society, and restore worth. Luke 17:21 says, the kingdom of heaven is in and around us all. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying words don't have power and that you have to go around creepily touching people. But what I am saying is that presence, touch, being human and filled with God's love is power. That is what we have to share with people. That is what creates community, an act, being present, touch. We are asked to be a holy experience to the people we come in contact with. We are called to be a healing presence. Not just smiling pretty on Sabbath morning, but to be a moving sanctuary effulging God's healing presence into people's lives. Some of you know that I am heading to the Philippines on Sunday. Some of you know that I have a nonprofit there, and it's probably one of the coolest things I've ever been able to be part of. It's called Project Propel. And there are so many ridiculous things that I can actually say about this ministry, but for the time, I will not. There is one story that I just heard of this last week where one of my best friends texted me, and she was like, you'll never guess what's going on out here. She said there's this one lady whose house burned down in the last couple weeks to the ground, everything she owns. Now, you have to understand, in these communities, it's a flood community, so a lot of them have experience with loss every year. But to have everything burned down means that even their physical structure, their furniture, everything is completely gone. She's been desolated. She has nothing to offer. But this woman not only shows up every single day to plant in our urban garden, but she's also helping us relaunch our newest one. She is in the community, empowering the community members to start a new life. She's showing them how to live life. She's guiding them through this process of healing. And not only that, the homes that she is crashing in, the homes that she is staying in, she's cooking them meals out of her garden. She is offering them tea time. She is creating space for community to come around and hang out. Here is a woman in a situation where her community would not expect her to have to reach out to them. She could truly just be receiving. But she's creating space and time for people to come together, and she is giving to them. She's holding other survivors of fires and hurts at the forefront. She's using this as an opportunity to guide people into a positive experience. She is living gospel in her community. This is what Jesus did. Jesus didn't look at just his little bubble, but he opened up his bubble to all that came near him. Jesus calls us out of our buildings and our comfort zones into a place where we can create healing. He lives out being a communitarian. He lives out Isaiah 58:12, where it says, urging us to restore the society around the church. He wants healing, not just a building, but in our daily lives and in our communities. We may not have the capabilities to fly across the world to save the orphaned or introduce clean water into local communities, but we can reach across the table when someone is hurting and be in a moment with someone who is heartbroken. We can spend time in our communities, not just observing people from a distance, but experiencing life and healing with everyone that we come in contact with. We can spend time with our kids. We can volunteer time to help our friends move. We can be present when people talk to us. We have the opportunity to touch the people around us, breathing life into the gospel message. Healing comes with active presence, with touch, with community. Healing comes when the gospel gets legs that are not just words. Gospel message gets energy when we no longer stand completely at a distance from people around us, but we join in each other's spaces and create healing and opportunity. God has created space in all of us to be kingdom now, to be life-giving, to be a source of energy and love for all that we come in contact with. God says to us, go. He says, love. He says, heal. I've seen people in our church step out and love on our community. I've watched some of you walk out of these doors and live big, huge lives that no one notices, and you've revolutionized individuals' lives. What would our community turn into if we all let the gospel message grow legs in our personal lives? What would the gospel message look like to you? And where are you letting the gospel message grow in your life?